How's it going? Thank you all for listening or watching episode 2 of the Expert Mind and Body podcast presented by the Society for Neurosports. My name is Julius Thomas. I'm here with Dr. Jose Antonio.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to have you on. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the muscle during training, post-training, and how is the tissue healing and recovering so that you can go train again. I know most people that are interested in Society for Neurosports or exercisers on their own, we're always undergoing this process. And I've always been kind of curious about what's happening, but let's start off with a little introduction.
Okay.
You know, we'll break into the science, but tell us a little bit about your background, education, and kind of how you got into the field of exercise science.
Okay. Well, thanks, Julius, for having me on the show. A little bit about myself. I actually, my undergrad degree was in biology. I got a master's degree in exercise physiology from Kent State University, and I got my PhD in muscle physiology at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. This was back in the early 90s when Bill Clinton was still president, for those of you who are American history fans. And then I actually did a postdoctoral research fellowship in the field of metabolism and endocrinology, where my focus is primarily on the regulation of androgens and the androgen receptor in skeletal muscle. However, my interest has always been in sports nutrition and human performance. It looks like I kind of did sort of this weird route to get to that point, but really I purposely chose that route because I wanted to learn as much basic science as possible before going into the human performance and sports nutrition realm. So since really the 90s, my focus has been in sports nutrition and human performance. My interest in it stems from watching, and this will really date me, the 1972 and 76 Olympics.
Yeah.
You weren't alive.
Yeah.
But here I am as a little kid watching it, and I saw this Soviet Union sprinter. His name was Valery Bortsov. He doubled in the 100 and the 200, which as a kid, I think you're either fascinated by speed or power, especially little boys. And for whatever reason, speed fascinated me. I mean, you see, for strength or power, it's generally, well, bigger people are stronger. I'm like, okay, that makes sense. But when you watch someone who's really fast, it's like, how do they do that? And so that got my interest in it. I was a huge fan of Muhammad Ali, super fast, you know, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Huge fan of Bruce Lee, another super fast athlete. So since then, it's like, when I see really fast movements, it's like, wow, how do they do that?
How does that happen?
Yeah, how does that happen? So to me, the whole area of human performance from an exercise training standpoint and also sports nutrition has always been, you know, interest to me. So, and you played at the highest level, certainly with pro ball. You have real world experience in terms of how some of these people can be really good at one thing, which is kind of interesting that you could be really good at one thing.
And then all the practice, and let's face it, a lot of the genetic components that go into that. But you said something that I thought was really interesting. And before we move into your hobbies and kind of get to see you as a person outside of a researcher and scientist, you said that you wanted to learn about as much basic science before you got into performance and nutrition.
Yeah.
But why? I mean, so many people don't really want to take the time to do basic science, or maybe don't see the value in it. But I think this would be a good chance to talk about how that really helped you in what you're doing now.
Yeah, what's interesting in my specific field, exercise and sports science, oftentimes people immediately go into these specialized courses, whether it's exercise physiology, human nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. When I thought, this is back when I was an undergrad, I think the better approach is to take as much basic science, biology. One of my favorite classes was evolution, cell biology, molecular biology, biochem, and chemistry in general. And I thought, if you understood chemistry, all this other shit's easy. And believe chemistry is hard. Chemistry was very hard for me. I studied like hell just to pass the class. But if I could understand the basic science, I could easily translate that into the study of exercise, because exercise really is, and sports neuroscience really is it's an integrative field where you're trying to pull in different fields. But if you don't understand the basic science of all these fields, it's kind of hard to understand what's going on. And that's why I thought, and I tell students this all the time, get as much basic science as possible, and the rest of it becomes easy.
No, I think I really agree with that so much, because when you understand the basic science, I like to refer to it as you understand the mechanisms at which the body works.
Right.
And once you start really looking at that basic science, you start seeing it down at the cellular level, the body doesn't care if you're playing sports, if you're running down the street, or if you're just doing your favorite workout on the weekend. It's going to follow these rules.
No, it's funny you say that. Your skeletal muscles don't know what you're doing. You're performing a movement. Now let's take something, and I know we'll eventually get to this, but let's take something as you're training for mass. A lot of people, high school kids, high school boys, they want to get larger, right? For whatever, wrestling, football, or whatever. Skeletal muscle fibers don't know what you're doing per se. It only knows that you're supplying tension to it. Now, does it matter if you do super heavy weights with few reps, or let's take the polar opposite, maybe much more repetitions, but you do it to failure? To skeletal muscle, it's just thinking, I need to adapt to the stimulus that I'm imposing. And there are multiple types of stimuli that can get the same result, oddly enough. Now, when you're dealing with performance sports, it's a bit different because it's really more you're teaching your brain to tell your muscles what to do. And I remember when I was doing my PhD, the guy next door was actually a neurophysiologist, and he always said, you guys are studying muscle. Muscles are dumb. It's the brain that tells you what to do. And I was like, I can't really argue with you. You're right. The brain is telling us what to do. And he's like, you're focused. They say you're focusing on the wrong thing. And I said, well, actually, you need to focus on both things. But I was like, the brain's too complicated for me right now, so I'm going to focus on muscle because it's kind of cool.
Yeah. No, I like that. And, you know, just the motor cortex and motor function in general. And I think I like to refer to just how beautiful the body operates when we're doing the right things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's how doing performance and training correctly and nutrition, how they all supplement going about and being that Muhammad Ali or that 100, 200 runner. But talk to me a little bit about some of your hobbies. I mean, I know, but, you know, share with everybody else about the things that you like to do in your spare time.
Yeah, I always tell people I'm a pretty simple guy. I like living in South Florida because it's warm all year, and I spend, as many people know, I spend most of my time out on the water, either in the ocean or we have an intercoastal in South Florida where I do a lot of stand-up paddling. To me, having been in a gym so much, you know, I remember starting in college, I either ran or I lifted or I did both. Yeah. And I got to a point where it's like, and I think everyone sort of gets to this point where, do they really want to spend more time in a gym? Whereas if you live in a place like South Florida where you could be outside all the time, I prefer to be outside. So I do that for fun. I actually, on occasion, do some racing. And for me, I need to challenge myself.
Yeah.
It's not so much, am I better than other people? It's more, can I be better than I was last year and the year before and the year before? And the nice thing about stand-up paddling versus something like running, and I know you hate running, by the way, because running is a low-skill sport, it's hard to get better as you get older. But because paddling is a high-skill sport, and you can take other high-skill sports like swimming or even skiing, you can always get better on the skill part, even though general conditioning may drop with age. And so it's an interesting trade-off. It's like, I'm actually getting better, even though I'm getting older. It's because of the skill. Because I know, I've seen the data, starting at like age 30 or 35, max VO2 starts to drop. Even if you train hard, strength starts to drop, bone mineral density starts to drop. Now, training will slow it down, but at the end of the day, age always wins. And that's the bad part. Is like, okay, I know age will win, but I'm going to keep fighting age till it beats me.
Yeah, exactly. Biology is cruel, but I think that that's what's interesting about performance is even when we have some of these, you know, physical abilities, they may be slowly declining with age. But like you said, if the skill improves, now the performance is now having that inverse relationship with age. And I mean, think about how many sports you see that in. I mean, you look at basketball, football, and you see these guys now that are in their late 30s and they're still being able to do really well on the field. And it's like, it's head scratching.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is people are taking better care of their bodies now. The nutrition's better. The training is so much better. I mean, if you go back to professional football in the 60s and 70s, there's basically guys who were big and fast and they kind of ate, but they didn't really know what they're doing. Weight training was actually not that, it wasn't really a critical factor even during the 70s. If you go back to the old Pittsburgh Steelers that dominated the 70s, a lot of those guys were just naturally strong, and maybe they lifted weights, but it wasn't really regimented. In fact, it's not till you get to the 1990s University of Nebraska football team that at the college level, they implemented weight training. And I don't know if you remember, the University of Nebraska in the 90s was a powerhouse. And now everyone lifts weights. Hey, you go to a D3 school, they all lift weights. So it's like, well, there goes our secret. So now just weight training alone has contributed so much to performance and recovery in all these athletes. And it's really amazing that sports science has gone from really nothing to being integrated in almost all professional sports. Because, I mean, even back when I was in high school, I mean, I remember our PE teacher, and there's no PE now, which is really odd.
Yeah,
but remember the PE teacher saying that, well, you know, stupid stuff like for football players, well, since you're out of shape in the summer and you come back, we're going to test you on the 1 mile run. And I'm thinking, what football player ever runs a mile?
Yeah.
You know, or take salt tablets instead of drinking water, when in fact now we know you should mix water with salt, hence sports drinks. But it has changed so much since then. It has changed so much.
No, I mean, that's fascinating, because I mean, you really sit to see how sports science has changed the health in the moment, and then long term for the athletes. It's changed the way what we expect from the athletes, how the games are played, and that's what I think is really going to make today's topic interesting, because we see these movements and we see these great feats of athleticism, but we often don't get a chance to talk about what's actually happening within the muscles. And I know we talked a little bit earlier, but could you kind of take us through in like a slow, for us beginners, of how the muscle responds to training, and some of the maybe the proteins or molecules that are important for muscle function?
Yeah, no, this is an interesting question, because one of the things I was really interested in when I was in college was how does the body adapt to exercise? Now, I think the first thing we got to do is separate exercise into the extremes, and then we can understand the middle. What are the extremes? The extremes are strength, power, speed, and then endurance. So most of the original research was done on the endurance side. So let's take distance running, distance cycling, distance swimming. When you impose an exercise stimulus that's for endurance, it produces a certain set of proteins that are important for adaptation. In this case, the primary proteins are the ones related to mitochondria. And for people who know a little bit of biology, mitochondria, we call it the powerhouse of the cell. You produce a lot of ATP aerobically. So when you do endurance type stuff, you're basically telling the nucleus of that cell to say, we need more enzymes related to the Krebs cycle, aerobic metabolism. We need to make more mitochondria, but we don't need to make more actin and myosin, because that would make the cell larger. Let's take the other extreme, strength power sports or in the speed sports. In general, the stimulus has to be different, because obviously the sport is different. And one of the adaptations is you actually want to produce a little bit more actin and myosin to increase the cross-sectional area of the muscle fiber. Why? Because in these sports, guys and girls tend to be larger because they got to produce more power. So those are the extremes. Now, the challenge in sports is that there's a lot of the stuff in the middle, where, let's say, take soccer. It's a speed sport. They're sprinting and stopping, but the distance they cover can be anywhere from 6 to 9 miles in a game. So you're thinking, well, 6 to 9 miles, that's like running. Sort of, but not really. In fact, I always say speed running 10,000 meters on a track is not the same as speed running up and down the soccer field. In fact, the adaptations are completely different. And part of it is with the speed sports like soccer, rugby, football, part of the adaptation has to be neural, because there's only so much skeletal muscle can do. A lot of it is training your brain to be aware of a field. And some people are great at what I call situational awareness, others are not. And that's why you have to be, are you one of those people who have situational awareness that you need for team sports? Or are you an individual sports person who's like, you know what, give me a finish line, I'll just run as fast or cycle as fast as I can go. So you have to break it down into the extremes to understand what's going on in the middle. But the middle is it's very complicated. To me, it's not even simple, but the simplest sports to train for and learn to adapt would be the distance sports and the power sports.
Because you're either or. You're not having to use both of those.
But here's the funny part. Some people are like, well, I'm going to be great in both. And the first thing I say is, it's not possible. First of all, physiologically, it's not possible, because you're giving the nucleus of the cell different signals. It's saying, wait, do you want me to make more actin and myosin, or do you want me to make more mitochondria? I got to choose one or the other. Okay, since I'm getting both signals, I'll make a little of both. So you kind of get better in both, but not great in either. That's why if you're in a speed power sport, I tell people, do zero cardio. We're talking about the pure sports, like 100-meter dash. If you run indoor track and sprints, if you're a soccer goalie, hockey goalie, high jump, long jump, triple jump, all the sports do no cardio because the stimulus you provide has nothing to do with the sport. Now, here's what's interesting. On the flip side, endurance training, you can actually, this is where weight training is interesting. Weight training actually helps all athletes. So this is where it's a bit of a paradox. Aerobic training may hurt speed power athletes, but weight training helps everybody, but also for different reasons. Weight training will help the aerobic athletes because it might make them more economical, meaning the amount of energy they expend may be less at a given workload. So I'm not sure what your original question was, but I sort of rambled.
No, it's good because what I think that what I've really taken out of that is one of the things that's important when we're talking about muscle function is what stimulus or what load are you putting on the muscle, and what kind of what proteins is that signaling that these muscle cells need. So on the endurance side, you know, that increased mitochondria use to say, okay, then we need ATP. And then for the kind of speed and power, it's actinin and myosin.
Yeah, because you got to produce force, you got to produce it fast.
And that's telling the muscle cell how it's going to develop based on these chronic stimulus that you're putting it under.
Right.
And then I started thinking, but what about a sport like football? We know football is not an aerobic sport.
Right.
So should they not be doing aerobic training? But then there are times where you can get pretty tired and you see it in different positions. But you know, how do you factor that in when you're thinking about training these muscles? I mean, obviously, there's usually the bigger athletes that play that sport.
Right.
What's happening in the muscle?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question because it doesn't apply to football. It applies to a lot of these team sports where they say, well, at the end of a game, I'm really tired, so that's got to be cardio. And my first response is, well, no, actually, it's not cardio. Cardio is part of it, but it's a small part of it. I think you have to understand what limits the game. Now, football is so complicated that you could literally be in worse shape than the other team, but you just have better skill, better quarterback, I mean, you're just better. So you can out-talent them. Now, let's say it's equal talent. So now we're getting to conditioning. So what is it about football that causes fatigue? So you have to figure out what causes fatigue in an athlete. So football, well, you're only playing half the game because, you know, no one plays two ways anymore. So you're only on there. A play lasts, what, 6-7 seconds maybe? You get 30 to 45 seconds rest roughly between. So what is causing fatigue when you're doing maximal work for 6 to 7 seconds and then resting for 30 to 45 seconds?
Yep.
It's primarily the two energy systems. And I know we had talked about this earlier, but it's primarily the production of ATP and phosphocreatine, which would be your ATP PCR energy system. And also
that's the endurance.
No, that would be the speed. That's the speed power. And then there's also fast glycolysis. Some people call it the lactic acid energy system, but it's using the breakdown of glycogen to produce exercise, right?
Yeah.
So football is mainly that. It's those two energy systems. It does use the aerobic system, but not to the extent that you would expect, even though, well, people are like, well, I'm breathing heavy. Well, you're breathing heavy mainly because you're trying to get rid of the acid from lactate, and you're getting rid of it through CO2. So you got to ventilate more. But the limiting factor is not aerobic endurance. The limiting factor is your ability to tolerate, and I hate to use the word lactic acid because technically you don't have lactic acid in your body, you have lactate, and then you produce hydrogen ions, which lower the pH of muscle. That tends to be a limiting factor, all else being equal. Of course, the problem is all else is never equal. I mean, you might have an offensive line where the guy's just better. You know, stuff like that happens. So anytime when we're dealing with skill sports, it's so hard to separate what are the factors of success. But when you're talking just about conditioning, the one thing I would not have football players do is I would not have them do traditional cardio. I would have them do interval training. So it could be, let's say for the wideouts, the running backs, they could do 60 to 100 meter repeats with, you know, a 30 to 60 second rest. Whereas the O lineman, kind of big, maybe do 10 meter repeats.
So you're saying is that for the sport of football specifically, it's about kind of like that heart rate training. Is that why you would say the intervals, or are you saying the intervals mainly from how their muscles can adapt to recovering in between these bursts?
Yes.
Of speed and power?
The intervals is to mimic the actual game because it's it's high. It's the energy output is super high for a short time, then you recover, but then you got to keep repeating it.
Yeah.
And you will be tired in the fourth quarter,
Yep.
but you're not tired because of cardio. You're tired because you have to figure out, well, you don't really figure it out. Your body adapts to being able to, you produce all this acid, and now you got to get rid of it. And then obviously there's neural fatigue too, because you're focused, and after a while you're just, God, my brain is tired. That's why baseball players like, taking greenies and amphetamines, because their entire sport is, I need to be focused, because the play lasts this long, and when the ball comes to you, you better be ready.
Yeah.
And the ball may never come to you in baseball. So you have to be neurally prepared for these in these sports.
Yeah, and I want to stick with this muscle fatigue thing, because I think this is such an interesting concept. And so let's take it from out of like these performance sports.
Okay.
Say, you're an individual that likes to go on Orange Theory or something.
Okay.
So you're over there.
I know someone who loves Orange
I do
Theory.
too.
Yeah.
Some people swear by it, and I'm not an Orange Theory person myself. But hey, whatever fits.
I don't know many Orange Theory people. That's the thing. I just know one.
Well,
okay.
I think I know 2 or 3. Not to single anyone out.
Okay.
But, so when you're on that treadmill or you're on a rower,
yeah.
What's happening in that muscle that's creating that fatigue? I know that you said that there's different types of training that create different types of, but what's being depleted, or what's that muscle need?
Okay, I can summarize for you what Orange Theory is, because it goes back in college. This is back in the 80s. I used to work at a place called Nautilus Fitness Center. Nautilus Fitness Center is based on the idea that you go from exercise to exercise to exercise, very little rest, because the idea was, I want to train the ATP PCR system, lactic acid system, and the aerobic system. Okay, you can sort of train them all, but it means you get mediocre results with all, right?
Kind of like you talked about, is you're tricking the cells.
Yeah, it's like you either want to be really good at one thing, or you kind of get better at everything. Orange Theory is based on the idea that if you go from exercise to exercise, whether it's from the treadmill to the rowing machine to weights, that it's basically modified circuit weight training, right? So you're getting some resistance training, right? Because you're doing weights. You're getting some cardio because you're rowing and doing treadmill or whatever. So the idea is that if you only have 30 to 60 minutes to work out, why don't I maximize that by doing everything?
Yep.
It sounds good. But again, this depends on the goal. If your goal is just general fitness, I think it's great.
Yeah.
If your goal is to be a really good aerobic athlete, you want to run a 5K faster, it sucks. If your goal is to get stronger and bigger, it sucks. Can I say sucks on this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Not really a scientific term, but
no.
I kind of have to use it sometimes.
We get it colloquially because that makes sense. And so what's being depleted when you're just a general fitness, everyday weekend warrior? What's being depleted in the muscles? And how do we repair that? Or
Perfect.
What do we need to put in?
That's a great question. Okay, so what's being depleted? In general, what you're losing or being depleted is muscle glycogen. So muscle glycogen is the primary fuel source. Right. So you have glycogen that's stored in the liver, glycogen stored in muscle, and then you have glucose, right? So you use that as fuel. You got to replenish it post-exercise, typically through, you can eat a mixed meal. That'll do it. Is it necessary to consume carbs immediately post? I'd say no, because the intensity and duration isn't long. It's not high enough or long enough. So you got to do that. Now, there will be some muscle damage caused primarily from the weight training, but not from the cardio, because the cardio, it doesn't change that much. It's not like you're doing downhill running or doing some, it's not like the rowing is that much harder than it was before, because you're doing a circuit. So the amount of damage will not be that much other than from weight training. So how do you repair that? Well, this is where it gets interesting. Probably what you need to do is focus on protein intake, because of there's a turnover that skeletal muscle goes through when you exercise. So there's enhanced turnover. So how do you repair skeletal muscle fibers? Well, increased protein intake is one. The amino acid leucine is probably the key amino acid that's involved in skeletal muscle repair. Obviously, non-nutritional things like sleep, general rest, and things like that. And also, as you know, as an athlete, what some people do is just they'll modify their training so that the next day they do something different and let those other muscles recover. But from a pure recovery standpoint, it's primarily protein and amino acids. Secondarily, providing carbohydrate through a mixed meal to replenish muscle glycogen. And the third one, which in South Florida is kind of, we all sort of know about it, maybe in Minnesota, they don't think about it, but rehydration. Here, we sweat so much, we lose so much sodium that we know you got to rehydrate. And I always tell people down in South Florida to liberally salt their food, put as much salt as you can, because There's no way. If you eat well, it's very hard to get a lot of sodium. So you
Mhm.
have to salt your food.
Yeah.
I mean, I put soy sauce because the Asian thing.
It works.
Yeah.
So when you're doing any type of training and you put these muscles under whatever it is, maybe it's an endurance load or it's a power load,
Mhm.
what is that muscle produce that signals to the rest of the body that, hey, we just underwent a challenge, we need this to come back and begin our recovery phase at that level?
Wait, rephrase that again. So you have, let's take the distance runner because that's the simplest sport.
Let's do the distance
Yeah,
runner.
he's
They just get done with a marathon.
okay.
A
26.
killer.
Yeah.
Legs wobbly.
Right.
What is in and around the muscles that's creating that sensation, and what does the body do to help recover so that they're able to get back at it?
Okay, so there's a couple things going on. One, they've got glycogen depletion. So there's literally probably zero glycogen in skeletal muscle or
Wow.
close to zero.
Yeah.
Number two, the amount of damage their skeletal muscles have undergone is tremendous. So
What's the damage?
here's what's interesting for the people who paid attention in high school biology. If you look at a section of skeletal muscle, let's say you take the fiber and you break it down,
Yep.
people might remember the Z line to Z line, and you have sarcomeres where you have actin and myosin. The Z lines actually get torn, and you actually have tearing of the outer membrane of skeletal muscle. So you could think of skeletal muscle, even though technically it's not a tube, but we draw it like a tube.
Yep.
You know, I've never seen it as a tube. There are literally holes in the muscle because the sarcolemma or the cell membrane has been torn. And what's interesting is one of the markers of damage is it leaks out a protein called creatine kinase. So if you take someone's blood and measure plasma CK or creatine kinase, all of a sudden, it's like crazy high after running a marathon, after doing heavy lifting weights, et cetera, et cetera. So you literally have to damage a cell that has been ripped and torn apart. Now, it's not like the entire muscle is ripped.
Not like a visible thing that we could see.
You can't see
we're
it.
talking about
It's
molecular
microscopic.
level.
Right. So you get these micro tears in the sarcolemma, and the only way to repair that is rest and the provision of protein. Now, there is something interesting that getting into cell biology, I hope people like cell biology.
Mhm.
If you look at you know how when you go to a restaurant and they give you a straw and there's a paper wrapper, right?
Yep.
Think of the paper wrapper as the basal lamina of skeletal muscle, and the outside of the plastic straw is the sarcolemma. So you have the cell membrane and basal lamina.
Yep.
In between those two,
So
something
in between the wrapper and the
straw
okay.
is something called a satellite cell. Now, I know there's satellite cells in the brain, but we're talking about satellite cells in muscle.
Mhm.
When you damage muscle, whether it's from exercise or my example is, well, you can either exercise or I could stab you with a fork, right? So I stab your bicep, rip up your muscle. Your muscle doesn't know it's damage. It's like damage from a knife, damage from exercise, it's still damage. So you have these satellite cells. You have a lot of them.
Mhm.
They undergo mitosis in the presence of damage, right? So you damage it, and for cell division, they end up going to areas of skeletal muscle to repair it. So when you activate the satellite cells, you end up providing the mechanism for muscle repair. And also it provides the mechanism, and this is more bodybuilding stuff, for producing new fibers or hyperplasia.
Mhm.
So to activate satellite cells, you got to damage it. And that's why this constant remodeling of skeletal muscle fibers occurs from exercise. Creatine helps satellite cells. That's one thing. Anabolic steroids help with satellite cells. So there's all these things, whether it's legitimate nutritional aids or performance enhancing drugs, that will help activate satellite cells. So those are an important part of the recovery of skeletal muscle.
Yeah, so basically, correct me if I'm wrong, what you described was what's happening cellularly that creates hypertrophy.
Mhm.
And this is what's happening when we're training the muscles under certain loads. You're putting in these little tears. And then this is, I guess, in a way, signaling a sort of immune response of, hey, look, we've got this damage. We need to come in, repair, regenerate, and you probably have maybe some inflammation in there. And this is telling the body, hey, we just underwent something that was extremely challenging. Send the goods. If you want us to repair and I forgot the word you used when you actually build, when it actually creates new muscles.
Oh, hyperplasia.
Hyperplasia.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, again, that goes back to the original point of what's the stimulus? Well, for endurance sports, it's the protein you want to make are mitochondrial proteins.
Mhm.
With strength power sports, the proteins you want to make are actin and myosin, because you need the muscle mass
Yeah.
to produce power. And you can't fool your muscle. That's the thing. People are like, well, well, I seem to like talk a little bit, but I don't know if you remember FloJo, Florence Jordan.
Yep.
Okay. She used to hold the record and it was broken in the Olympics, right? So she used to hold 100-meter dash record. When she retired, and it seems like a lot of sprinters do this, she said, I'm going to run a marathon. And people thought, wow, she's going to do great. And I'm thinking, oh, no, she's going to stink at it. You cannot get a world-class sprinter and make them a good, I mean, she can finish the race.
Yeah.
She's not going to be a good marathon. And you can't even do the opposite. You can't get a world-class marathoner. I'm going to be a 100-meter guy.
Yeah. Ain't
going to happen because, first of all, the genetics aren't there.
Sure.
And also the stimulus is so different. It is just so different. And so I think we got to be aware of, I always say there's a principle of exercise training that can kind of explain all this. It's called the SAID, S-A-I-D, specific adaptations to impose demands. So it's sort of like, what do you want to be? What's your goal? Well, the adaptation you will get is directly related to the demand you put on skeletal muscle and or heart. I mean, obviously your heart has to adapt too. So specific adaptations to impose demands, the SAID principle.
Yeah. So basically, what's your goal? Are you doing what's aligned with helping you reach this goal?
Right.
Or are you saying you want to be the person that's going to become a PhD one day, but reading books is just something you're not really into?
That's great. That probably explains it better than some of the exercise analogies I use. But it's sort of like this. People say, "Well, I could have been a rocket scientist." Well, you got to pass physics first.
Exactly.
Not everyone can be a rocket scientist.
That's so true. And then this makes me think about just the research in areas of recovery. Does the research talk about just how long that healing these tears that we put in our muscles takes? Like, I think if I'm just the person that, I want to be kick-ass at Orange Theory, or I want to be great in the Spartan race locally, when I'm going and I'm putting my muscles through challenges, how long do I need to wait? What is that like until I'm ready to go again, so I'm not tearing them down before they're ready to go?
It's a great question, because there's even data going back 20 or 30 years where there's an uncoupling of pain, like pain post-exercise, and damage. Meaning there's electron microscopic data of skeletal muscles that are still damaged, just like we see it, but the person no longer feels pain. So the question is, well, what exactly is recovery? Is recovery now you don't feel pain, or is it when the skeletal muscle completely recovers? Now the problem is, if you train hard enough, skeletal muscle, I don't think ever completely recovers. This, you wake up in pain every day. It's just part of being an elite athlete. Right. There's no way you're pain-free. So knowing that, so how do you measure recovery? And I think recovery in this sense almost has to be, what's funny is I end up always going back to what's the simplest thing coaches and athletes deal with. Coaches ask, how do you feel? Because oftentimes how you feel is an arbiter of how you will train that day versus, what's your resting heart rate? What's your resting testosterone? Yeah. I'm like, you can do all that, but
that's the source.
Right. And it's sort of like this. I know that, one of the measures suppose of overtraining is your testosterone to cortisol ratio. If T drops and cortisol goes up. And as useful as it might be, there are athletes who still perform well, even when all the other markers suck. And then there are those athletes who perform poorly, even when the markers are good. So what do you go by? It's at the end of the day, you have to go by, well, how do you feel? Do you feel fine? Did you sleep well? Okay, you're going to be in pain. Everyone's in pain. Everyone in this room is in pain. You just got to deal with it. So I go back to the simplest thing, and that's I remember my father saying this. He was a physician. He said, 99% of what I learned is I get the history of the patient. That tells me almost everything. Yeah. Coaches and athletes, it's like doctor-patient. You talk to them, they give you feedback. Yeah. That sounds stupid and simple, but it actually works. And 100%. Rather than people so focus on technology, well, what does your monitor say? What's your heart rate variability? I'm like, after a while, it's noise.
Yeah, we can become objective to the point that now we're ignoring the subjective. And is that productive?
Right.
I've been kind of thinking about, I'm starting to call this a myth. The more I read, the more people I talk to, the more I think about my own experience as an elite athlete, I continue to think that there's this kind of conception that elite athletes are the healthiest. And I'm starting to think that this has to be a myth, because when you're competing, you're pushing your body past probably where it wants to go. You're now having so many repetitions at this motion that your joints, the tissues around that you're using to do these movements, they start to break down. It's like you see an NBA All-Star that played 19 years, and the guy's limping around the
Can barely
hotel
walk.
lobby after that. And so then I started thinking, well, that's how this stuff gets conflated. Is what's the right amount of recovery? And then you want to look at LeBron James. And you're like, wait, but what LeBron James is doing is already above and beyond what we would consider as a healthy moderation.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of concept, I know it's hard for people in America, moderation, and to start thinking about how people that train at an elite level, they're not the healthiest physically. No. And how do we help people understand that? Yeah, that's them.
Yeah. Well, I always say competitive athletics has never been about health.
That's what I need people to understand.
Right. It's always been about winning. The goal is to win almost at all costs.
Almost.
Yeah. I mean, depending on how much money's involved, it's almost at all costs. Yeah. And there is a weird irony that if you follow some of the data of Olympic athletes after they've retired, the ones that tend to do best health-wise are the ones that are able to maintain normal body weight, because oftentimes they don't train as much, they eat more, and they just gain weight. And you see this with professional football, basketball, baseball. It's almost as if, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when I see a former athlete who's actually lost weight look good, I'm like, wow, that's really unusual. Yeah. Because usually I feel like they just sort of go to pot. Like they're so sick of training that it's like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not going to train. I'm going to sit and eat and enjoy life.
Yeah.
Although that may not be the best strategy. But yeah, competitive athletics, it's like, I remember I used to work with this world-class distance runner 20 years ago, and she said, my easy days are hard. My hard days are harder. I'm always on the brink of being injured. Yeah. But that's the sport. Yep. If you're not on the brink of being injured, someone's beating you. Yeah. Someone's beating you.
100%. I always tell people that if they're looking for a simple way to understand this concept, just look at the odometer on a car. And when you look at the RPMs, 1,000 to 5,500, all good. Yeah. But once you get into the 6,000, 7,000, now you're redlining. And some people, I don't think they really understand it. To be an elite athlete, it means being in the red line
all
since
the time.
age 10 till you retire. Yeah. And then, like you said, then you get done, and then you see so many athletes that become sedentary, and people go, why? And it's like, oh, extra running is punishment, because that's how I was punished. The weight room is where somebody forced me to be. And so you get these associations psychologically that become difficult. And then what's your reason to inhibit all this pain now that you've accumulated and this damage to these joints? And you're like, and me at this point, Jose, I don't run. There's no chance.
Well, there's probably a million other people who you're like, even if they weren't competitive athletes, are like, I don't want to run it. It hurts and it's just not fun, right? Yeah. But do you lift?
Yeah, I do lift.
But probably not to the extent that you.
Nope.
Yeah. So
I won't put that on my spine anymore.
Okay. So you managed to figure out what works for you, and actually you practiced some jujitsu, right?
Absolutely.
So you're still challenging your brain to learn a skill. Mm-hmm. And to me, as people get older with exercise, I think as long as they pick a sport or activity where it challenges their body, but also challenges their brain to adapt to a movement or a new skill, I think that's the best choice versus just kind of keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, So, and jiu-jitsu is hard as hell.
Yeah. I definitely didn't pick the easiest thing to do, but I get to be on a mat. There's no sprinting. I think it's going to preserve the little cartilage I have left in my joints. But so, I mean, I'm glad that you agree and we're able to talk about just how to break that relationship with what they're doing over there is the best possible thing that a human could be doing for their body, and to help people, because the majority of people that I would call exercisers are not, what percentage of that is actually going to be these elite athletes? Most people, when they're trying to figure out how do I put my body in the right place to have recovery, to train my muscles, it's about finding this moderation. It's about understanding that, hey, this is what broke down while you were training. Yeah. This is why what you're eating afterwards is important. And this is how you should really maximize your recovery. So maybe what should recovery look like for your typical
Okay.
exerciser?
No, that's a good
That
question.
doesn't get talked about a lot.
Right. For your typical exerciser who trains maybe 3 or 4 times a week, maybe does some cardio, does some weights, or does some combination. I always go back to the 3 R's, and I think this is fairly simple for most consumers. It's you got to rehydrate, so make sure fluid intake is good. If you are in a hot environment, make sure that fluid has some sodium. You have to replenish muscle glycogen because muscle glycogen is still the primary fuel. And to replace that, it's, eat and this is where going on low carb diets or carnivore diet may not be smart because you still have to replenish muscle glycogen. And to do that, you got to consume carbs.
Yep.
Now, it doesn't mean you're eating ho-hos and cupcakes. It could mean you're consuming rice or, people don't realize, yeah, fruits and vegetables are still carbs. It's not like you have to eat a donut to get carbs. And the last one is repair. So how do you repair skeletal muscle? The best way is to make sure protein intake is dialed in. And in general, I tell even recreational athletes, well, they say, well, how much should I consume? And I say, for every pound of body weight, try to get a gram. So if you weigh 150 pounds, get 150 grams. That's actually hard for a lot of people. It's even hard for athletes, I found out. Because let's say a chicken breast has about 30 grams. You're like, 30 grams of chicken breast? So I got to have 5 chicken breasts? Well, it doesn't have to be chicken breast. It could be, some shakes have 40 grams, so you get that immediately. Eating a mixed meal still has protein. And if you eat 3 mixed meals and then maybe throw in 1 protein shake, you'll probably get to 1 gram per pound. And to me, out of all those, the most difficult one for most people is the protein intake.
Yep.
Once they get that dialed in, I think they're much better off. And that applies to all athletes, even the competitive ones at the college level. If they get that dialed in, recovery is so much better. It's just so much better. And you've probably seen this where some of the older athletes, whether it's football, basketball, or baseball, as they get older, they're like, whoa, I don't recover like I did when I was 20.
Absolutely.
And so they start paying attention to sleep, to nutrition, and just eliminating stress that could negatively impact performance. When you're 18 to 20, it's like, you can go out, get drunk. You're like, wow, I feel great.
You're invincible back then.
Right, you're invincible. And then you hit 30, you're like, oh my God, I'm not invincible anymore. So you pay attention to those simple things. So rehydration, replenishment of muscle glycogen, and repair of skeletal muscle.
I don't know. I love that. I think that's going to be a great way for us to wrap up the 3 R's. If you're trying to really optimize your recovery, but you're not trying to invest in hiring your own strength and nutrition coach, and
right,
just the 3 R's.
The 3 R's.
That's replenish, rehydrate, repair. Proteins,
yep.
Carbohydrates, and good old-fashioned H2O.
Right, get that fluid intake in there, especially if you're in South Florida. You got to get that in there. So, yeah.
Well, thanks, man. It was great.
Hey, thank you.
Taught us a lot. Appreciate you coming on, and we'll have you back sometime.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Yep.